storm hit harder than any I'd seen in years. The wind howled against my cabin walls, rain pounded like bullets on the roof, and I thought I was alone just like every night for the last 6 years. But then came the sound. A heavy, desperate thud against the door, followed by a cry that didn't belong to the storm. I opened it with my pistol drawn, and there they were. Two dogs, one a powerful German shepherd, the other a sharp-eyed husky, collapsed on my porch. The husky, later I would call her Luna, stood guard with wild, frantic eyes. But the shepherd Atlas was lying in a pool of his own blood. The wound wasn't from a fall or a fight with a wild animal. I knew that instantly. It was a clean bullet wound, meant for killing. Someone had tried to silence him. I carried him inside, adrenaline cutting through the fog of solitude. As I cleaned the wound, my fingers brushed against something hard beneath his collar. I cut the lining open and found it a tiny sealed compartment. Inside was a drive, small and unmarked but heavy in my hand, with a meaning I couldn't yet name. In that moment I understood. These dogs hadn't come to me by chance. Atlas wasn't just a victim, he was carrying something people were willing to kill for. Whatever was on that drive, it wasn't just data. It was a secret that could bring down the most powerful men alive. And now it was sitting right here in my cabin on my table. If you want to know how this night changes everything for me, for Atlas, and for Luna, stick with me. And if the story grips you, I'd be grateful if you supported us by subscribing to the channel. The drive sat on my table, small and silent, yet heavier than any weapon I'd ever carried into combat. Atlas lay before the fire, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Luna pressed close to him, her blue eyes locked on me as if demanding I keep him alive. My hands were steady, but inside I felt the old tremor of recognition. This wasn't just about two dogs stumbling into my life on a stormy night. It was a message, a warning, a summons. For 6 years I had built walls higher than these mountains, convincing myself the world could not reach me here. My cabin clung to the ridge like a scar wood and stone, nailed together by a man who had lost everything and wanted nothing more than silence. I chose this place because it was beautiful, because it was empty, because no one could find me without meaning to. But as I stared at that drive, I knew the world had found me anyway. Each morning before the storm, my life had been a ritual of isolation. I woke before the sun, listening to the mountain breathe in the dark. The smell of pine and damp earth crept through the crack I always left in the window, a reminder that vigilance never truly sleeps. Coffee came next, black, bitter, strong enough to cut through memories I never asked to keep. I stood at the big window while the forest woke up, deer moving like ghosts through the misthawks, slicing across the pale sky. Out there, life went on. In here, I existed like a shadow. My cabin was sanctuary, but it was also a tomb. Every board creaked with echoes of voices that no longer filled the air. My wife's laughter, my daughter's songs, they lingered in the silence, like phantoms I could not exorcise. I told myself I came here to heal, but truth is I came here to disappear. And yet the ghosts followed. They followed in the sound of tires screeching on wet asphalt, in the smell of gasoline and blood, in the silence that came after. No matter how high I climbed, how far I ran, they were always waiting in the corners of my mind. I patrolled the perimeter of my land every day, boots sinking into mud, pistol at my side. Not because I expected anyone, but because the soldier in me never learned how to stand down. My eyes scanned the tree line, my ears tuned for the snap of a twig, the rush of wind that didn't belong. I told myself it was habit. Truth is, it was fear. Fear that if I let down my guard, the past would breach the walls I had built. Fear that even here, high in the Blue Ridge, I was not beyond its reach. And now here it was, staring at me from the table. A black drive hidden inside a dying dog's collar, carried through a storm to land on my doorstep. No accident. No coincidence. The world had slipped a knife between my ribs and reminded me that I was still in the fight, whether I wanted it or not. I looked at Atlas. His body was strong, built like a machine of muscle, and resolve, but broken now by a bullet designed for silence. Not the mark of a hunter, but the signature of an executioner. I had pulled metal fragments from bodies before, seeing the hollow eyes of men who never saw the shot that took them down. This was no mistake. Someone wanted this dog dead because of what he carried. And someone had trusted him enough to send him here to me. Why me? That question beat inside my skull, louder than the storm outside. I had buried my name with my family. I had left the uniform behind. I had sworn never again to answer the call of duty, never again to lift a weapon for anyone. And yet, as Atlas lay bleeding, and Luna's low whine filled the cabin. I felt that old weight settling on my shoulders. Responsibility. The burden of knowing that whatever secret was hidden in that drive was now mine to bear. The fire snapped, throwing shadows across the walls, and I saw myself reflected in the glass of the window, hollow-eyed silver creeping into my hair, jaw clenched like stone. I was 45 but felt twice that. The years of silence had not healed me. They had carved me into something unrecognizable. I thought I had cut myself free, but the truth was plain. The past never let go. It circled above like a vulture, waiting for the moment you collapsed, then dropped without mercy. My cabin had always been both my shield and my prison. I built it with my own hands, stacking logs with the fury of a man who needed to sweat out grief, hammering nails as if each strike could bury the memories deeper. I told myself the stone hearth was for warmth, but it was really a barricade fire crackling loud enough to drown out the silence of loss. The walls kept out the world, but they also sealed me inside with my ghosts. For 6 years, I convinced myself that was enough. Tonight proved it wasn't. As Atlas stirred in his uneasy sleep, Luna pressed closer, her breath visible in the cold drafts slipping through the cracks of my old cabin. She wasn't just guarding him. She was watching me, measuring me. Those ice-blue eyes seemed to ask if I would abandon them, if I would send them back into the storm. I wanted to tell her no. I wanted to tell her I had nothing left to give, but the words stuck. Because deep down I knew I couldn't turn away. Not this time. I poured another coffee, the bitterness sharp against my tongue. The storm rattled the windows, thunder rolling down the ridge like artillery. My heart pounded in that same rhythm. I thought of the drive again, of the invisible hands that had fired the bullet into Atlas's side. They hadn't just been aiming at him. They had aimed at anyone who would take him and anyone reckless enough to open the door. They had aimed at me. And that truth burned through the fog like lightning. The past had found me. The silence I built wasn't protection, it was a lure. I had been hiding in plain sight, and someone had finally remembered my name. I leaned back in my chair, eyes never leaving the fire, the weight of the drive heavy in my pocket now. Outside, the mountain moaned under the storm's fury, and inside my chest felt no different. I wasn't safe here. I had never been safe. All these years I was just waiting for the knock on the door, the crash of thunder that wasn't thunder, the whisper of death finding me again. Tonight it had come, not with soldiers or sirens, but with fur and blood and amber eyes. The cabin groaned as the wind battered its frame. I looked around the room, wooden beams, blackened by smoke shelves, lined with supplies I thought would last forever, a rifle resting within arm's reach. It was supposed to be enough. But in the flickering firelight, the place felt less like a fortress and more like a coffin I had built with my own hands. Atlas shifted, letting out a low growl even in his sleep. Luna raised her head, ears pricked toward the door, as if the storm carried whispers only she could hear. I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. Whatever hunted them was still out there. And if it could find them, it could find me. For the first time in years, I wasn't just haunted by the past, I was hunted by the present. And as much as I wanted to sink deeper into the silence, I knew I couldn't. The mountain had given me refuge, but tonight it had betrayed me, reminding me that no place is safe, no heart is untouchable, and no secret stays buried forever. So I sat there staring at the flames, the drive heavy in my hand, the storm screaming outside, and I admitted the truth I had been avoiding for 6 long years. My exile was over. The war I thought I'd left behind had found its way back to my door, and this time it brought dogs who refused to let me hide. The storm deepened as night pressed down against the ridge. Rain slammed the roof in violent sheets and thunder rolled over the mountains like cannon fire. I sat in the chair by the fire, staring at the drive that now lived in my pocket, pretending it wasn't there. The flames hissed and cracked, but even their noise couldn't drown out the storm, or the gnawing thought that this wasn't over, that it hadn't even begun. Then it happened. A sound that cut through everything. It was a heavy thud against the door, so sharp it rattled the hinges. For an instant I thought the wind had hurled a branch against it. But then came another, a slower, weaker thud, followed by a low, broken cry that didn't belong to wood or storm. Every nerve in me lit up at once. Instinct pushed me upright, my hand finding the pistol on the table without a second thought. I moved toward the door in silence, bare feet against the worn planks, listening, measuring. I pressed an eye to the peephole, but all I could see was a wall of black rain. Still the cry came again, faint but undeniable. I slid the deadbolt and opened the door just enough for the storm to rip it wide, slamming it against the wall. And there they were. Atlas, the German shepherd, collapsed on the threshold, his fur slick with mud and something darker blood. His breaths came in shallow gasps, every rise of his chest a battle. Beside him, Luna stood drenched and trembling, her ice-blue eyes locked on mine with an urgency that pierced deeper than words. She didn't bark or growl. She just looked at me, pleading as if she knew I was her last hope. For a moment the world froze. The storm, the thunder, the ghosts, all of it fell away. Only those two remained, one on the edge of death, the other guarding him with the devotion of a soldier refusing to abandon his partner. I holstered the pistol and dropped to my knees. The weight of Atlas's body shocked me as I dragged him inside, muscles straining against his 100 pounds of deadweight. Luna followed instantly, brushing past my leg, refusing to leave him even for a step. I slammed the door shut, locking the storm outside, and the cabin fell into heavy silence, broken only by the fire and the labored breathing of the dog at my feet. My training took over. The part of me I'd tried to bury for years surged forward as if it had been waiting for this moment. I pulled a wool blanket from the cot and laid Atlas on it, shifting him toward the warmth of the hearth. Blood seeped from a dark patch in his flank, staining the fibers instantly. "Easy, boy," I muttered, my voice rough, unused. His amber eyes fluttered open for a second, hazy and dim, but they found me. That look, pain, trust, and something like a command, hit me harder than any bullet ever had. Then his head dropped again, too heavy for him to hold. I sprinted to the footlocker at the end of my bed, yanking it open. Inside, everything was in perfect order: sterile gauze, surgical tools, antiseptics, 4 bags. Military issue, maintained like relics. I hadn't touched them in years, but I kept them ready. For what I hadn't known until now. I snapped on gloves, wiped the wound with iodine, and shaved the fur around it with quick, precise strokes. My fingers moved on their own memory, guiding them the way muscle recalls a rifle's weight. The entry wound was clean, a neat hole just beneath the rib cage. The exit wound, though ragged, torn, and bleeding heavy. He'd lost a dangerous amount already. "Hold on," I said, though the words were for me as much as for him. I irrigated the wound with saline, the liquid washing blood across the floorboards. My forceps probed deep into torn muscle until I felt it, a shard of metal lodged near the exit. I clamped, pulled, and dropped it into a metal bowl. The clink echoed like a gunshot in the cabin. I leaned closer, studying it. The casing was peeled back, the jacket torn. This wasn't a hunter's round. It was small caliber, designed for silence, paired with a suppressor. I'd seen it before too many times. Professional work. The kind of bullet fired not for food or sport, but for clean, quiet killing. The knot in my gut twisted tighter. This wasn't an accident. Someone had marked this animal for death. I cleaned the wound again, packed it with gauze, and wrapped a bandage tight around his torso. From the IV kit, I slid a needle into his leg vein, hanging a bag of saline from a chair back. His body needed fluids. His system needed shock control. Antibiotics followed, measured carefully, injected into muscle. My hands never wavered, though my chest felt like it was caving in. Atlas didn't stir, but his breathing steadied just enough to keep me going. I sat back for a moment, wiping sweat from my forehead. My eyes drifted to Luna. She hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. She crouched beside him, ears forward, watching every motion I made. When our eyes met, she gave a low whine, almost like acknowledgement. A bond was forming, silent and raw. She knew I was trying, and she demanded I finish what I'd started. That's when I noticed the collar. Thick, high-quality nylon, reinforced with metal far sturdier than anything bought at a pet store. I ran my thumb along the padded lining and felt it, a hard lump beneath the stitching. Out of place. Wrong. The suspicion that had been gnawing at me sharpened into certainty. I pulled my utility knife, slicing through the seam with surgical care. The fabric peeled back to reveal a tiny plastic pouch, sealed and deliberate. Inside, pressed tight against the padding, was a matte black USB drive, small but rugged, built for durability. I froze, the firelight flickering across its surface in my palm. All at once, the night shifted. The storm outside, the wound, the blood, they were no longer random misfortunes. They were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to something bigger, darker. Atlas hadn't been just a victim. He had been a courier. A messenger. And someone out there wanted his message buried forever. I stared at the drive, its weight anchoring me to a truth I didn't want. Secrets like this didn't travel alone. They carried armies behind them, shadows that never stopped hunting until every witness was ash and silence. My gaze drifted back to Atlas. His chest lifted slowly, then fell again, stubborn and steady despite everything. Luna leaned against him, her head resting across his back as if to lend him her strength. They weren't just strays who found their way to my cabin. They had been sent or driven here, and I had been chosen, whether I liked it or not. The fire cracked again, showering sparks across the hearth. I tightened my grip on the drive, its cold edge biting into my palm. My cabin, my exile, my silence, all of it had been breached in one night. The ghosts of my past weren't the only ones haunting me anymore. Now they were hunters in the storm, men with rifles and quiet bullets, chasing two dogs who carried a secret that could topple the powerful. And by dragging them inside, by pulling Atlas back from the edge, I had stepped into that storm with them. Atlas survived the night. I wasn't sure how, but when dawn seeped pale and gray through the cracked window, he lifted his head. His eyes, amber and fierce, locked on mine. There was no fear in them, only purpose. Luna pressed close, tail thumping once against the floor, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. I could see it in both of them. They weren't finished. They weren't just here to survive. They had somewhere to go. I should have ignored it. I should have stayed in my cabin, kept the fires stoked, pretended the world outside the door didn't exist. But Atlas didn't give me that choice. He struggled to his feet, muscles trembling, bandage stained but holding. He turned toward the door, gave me one long look, then let out a low whine. Luna trotted forward, pawing at the wood. The message was clear. I strapped on my boots, checked the pistol on my hip, and slung my rifle across my back. The drive was in my pocket, heavy as a stone. When I opened the door, the air was sharp, cleansed by the storm mist, coiling through the hollows like ghosts reluctant to leave. Atlas stepped out first, slow but steady. Luna followed, and I fell in behind them. The forest was treacherous after the night's deluge. Mud sucked at my boots, branches lay splintered across the ground, creeks swollen to rivers. But the dogs moved with certainty. Atlas led nose close to the earth, pausing at forks to inhale the air, then pressing forward with quiet resolve. Luna scouted the edges, alert, her head snapping at every sound. They weren't wandering. They were following a trail invisible to me but carved into their bones. Hours passed. My muscles burned, but the old rhythm came back. Step after step, breath-measured, rifle shifting against my shoulder. It was almost like patrol again, the forest closing in, every rustle a warning. Yet there was no platoon at my back, no radio in my ear, just me and two dogs carrying me deeper into something I didn't yet understand. By midday, the trees thinned along a ridge. From that high ground, the valley stretched below, wild, untouched, except for one thing. Half buried in rhododendrons, its paint peeled, and shutters hanging loose, stood an old ranger station, forgotten by the world. Perfect for hiding. Atlas stopped, chest heaving, and looked back at me. Luna whined, her gaze fixed on the structure. My gut tightened. I scanned the clearing with binoculars. No fresh tire tracks, no smoke, no obvious movement. Still, something lingered in the air, an unease that clung like fog. We moved down the ridge in silence, each step cautious. I left the dogs in cover and circled the station rifle ready. The front door was barricaded, boards nailed across in haste. But a back window stood cracked, pried open, just enough for someone desperate to squeeze through. I listened, nothing but the wind. Then I slipped inside. The stench of mildew and damp wood hit me first. Dust layered every surface except for a few patches, footprints fresh and frantic. Empty water bottles in the corner, a blanket balled on the floor. Someone had been here recently, and not for comfort. A faint rustle came from the storage room. I raised my rifle, heart pounding with the slow rhythm of combat readiness, and pushed the door open. They were huddled in the corner, a woman dirt-streaked and gaunt, clutching a tire iron like her life depended on it. Beside her, pressed into her side, was a boy, no older than 8. His eyes were wide but vacant, the kind of emptiness I knew too well, the silence of trauma. "Stay back," she hissed, voice raw, trembling with exhaustion and defiance. I lowered the barrel, kept my free hand raised. "I'm not here to hurt you." Her eyes darted past me as Luna slipped through the door, tail low, ears pricked. Atlas followed, limping but unbroken. The woman's grip on the tire iron faltered for a heartbeat when she saw them. A flicker of recognition, or maybe hope, crossed her face. "You have the dogs," she whispered almost to herself. Then, louder with disbelief, "He made it barely," I said. "He was shot. I patched him up." Her lips trembled. She dropped the iron with a clang that echoed through the small room. Tears welled, cutting paths down her dirt-smeared cheeks. She pulled the boy closer, pressing her face into his hair. I lowered myself onto one knee, keeping distance but closing the silence. Tell me what's going on. She looked at me as though weighing the weight of her soul. My husband. He didn't make it. He sent Atlas. He said, if the worst happened, the dog would find you. The words hit harder than the storm had. Find me. Why me? My chest tightened, old wounds tearing open. Who was your husband? I asked. David, she said, her voice breaking. David Carson. The name tore through me like shrapnel. A man I once called brother in the desert heat, the one who bled beside me and swore we'd never stop watching each other's backs. We hadn't spoken in years, and now his widow sat trembling before me. The boy, her son, stared at the floor, unmoving, lost. His silence was heavier than any words. She told me everything in a torrent of broken sentences. David had left the service and become an investigative journalist. He uncovered something vast, monstrous, a global trafficking network run behind the facade of a tech empire. Victor Kane, a billionaire worshipped as a visionary, was the rot at its core. His logistics software, praised as revolutionary, was nothing more than a system to move human lives like cargo hidden in plain sight. David had gathered proof names, accounts, shipping routes, enough to burn the empire down. But he knew the danger. He prepared one contingency. If he fell, Atlas would carry the evidence to the only man he trusted. Me. I pulled the drive from my pocket, set it on the floor between us. Her breath caught. She stared at it like it was both salvation and curse. He died for that, she whispered, voice breaking into sobs. They ambushed us 2 nights ago. He fought, gave me and Carl a chance to run. He pushed the drive into Atlas's collar and told him to find you. Her hands shook as she clutched her son tighter. The boy didn't flinch, didn't cry. His eyes stayed hollow, fixed on the dirt. My throat closed. Memories I had locked away surged back, of my own family, of the night rain turned to fire on the asphalt. Loss, sudden and merciless. I looked at her, at the boy, at the dogs who had led me here, and I realized what the mountain had delivered to my door. It wasn't just a secret. It was a war. One my friend had died fighting. One I could no longer ignore. The cabin I thought was my tomb had become something else entirely. A staging ground. The ghosts of my past hadn't been content to haunt me. They had brought the living, bleeding proof that the fight was still raging, and it had found me whether I wanted it or not. I brought them back to my cabin before dusk, the widow and her boy trailing behind me like shadows. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. The silence stretched thin across the ridge. I could feel it pressing against us, the sense of being hunted. Atlas moved stiffly at my side, Luna pacing a wider circle, her eyes never still. By the time the cabin came into view, the boy's steps had slowed to a trudge, his hand clinging to his mother's sleeve. Inside, I lit the lamps low and bolted the door. The walls felt different now. For 6 years they had been my prison. Tonight they would become my fortress. Every board, every nail, every shutter had to hold. I guided them into the main room, told the woman to keep her son close to the hearth. Atlas collapsed onto the rug chest, rising in steady rhythm, Luna settling beside him. But their ears were pricked, their eyes restless. They knew what was coming as surely as I did. I went to work. Years of muscle memory took over every action, precise, economical. I dragged the heavy table across the door and braced it with iron brackets. Windows that once let in mountain light I sealed with storm shutters, leaving only narrow firing slits. I checked my rifle, cleaned the chamber, stacked magazines in neat rows along the mantel. My pistol went on the small table within reach of my chair. The cabin smelled of oil, wood smoke, and tension thick enough to choke. The woman, Rachel, she had told me her name, watched in silence, clutching her son Carl. His eyes never left the floor, his silence heavier than any scream. I saw my own grief mirrored in his small shoulders. He had locked himself away as I once had. But the walls around a child are thinner, more fragile. The night came down hard. The forest outside shifted into shadow and whisper. The storm had passed, but its absence only sharpened the quiet. I stood at the firing slit rifle ready, scanning the tree line. The dogs stirred restless. Then Atlas let out a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. They're coming, I said. Rachel tensed. I motioned for her to take Carl into the back room. There was a heavy oak dresser against the wall. Together we shoved it in front of the window. I pressed a canteen and a pistol into her hands. Only if you have no choice, I told her. She nodded, pale but steady. She knew the stakes. Back in the main room, I crouched low-sighted through the slit. At first, nothing. Then movement. Shadows slipping between trees, silent but deliberate. 3 of them, at first, dressed in black tactical gear rifles, with suppressors held tight. Professionals. My gut clenched, but my hands were steady. I let them come closer, closer still, until the lead man's boot snagged a wire I had strung days before, more out of habit than expectation. A cascade of tin cans rattled through the dark loud, as thunder in the silence. They froze. That half-second of hesitation was all I needed. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked like a hammer in the stillness. The lead man dropped. The others dove for cover, returning fire with sharp, muffled pops. Suppressed rounds tore splinters from the log walls. The siege had begun. "Down!" I shouted, voice cutting through the storm of gunfire. I crawled across the floor, shifting from one slit to another, firing short, controlled bursts. I moved constantly, never letting them pin me down. To them, it must have sounded like more than one shooter. That illusion kept them cautious. Atlas barked from the rear window, teeth, bared ears locked on the darkness. I trusted his instincts more than my eyes. I shifted position, raised the rifle, and caught sight of a figure flanking left. 2 quick shots sent him scrambling back behind a boulder, halted but not gone. The cabin shook with the rhythm of war. Bullets slammed into shutters, ricocheted off stone. The fire hissed, spitting sparks across the floor. Luna prowled like a ghost, her growl rising whenever the enemy pressed too close. Together, the dogs became my second set of eyes and ears, their senses sharper than any night vision scope. Minutes stretched like hours. My arms burned from the weight of the rifle, but I moved, fired, reloaded. Shadows shifted. More men joined the fight. They tightened the noose. My odds shrank with every passing moment, but the mountain was mine. I knew every angle, every blind spot. They might have had numbers, but I had the ground. Then came the breach. A thunderous crack as a charge ripped through the west wall, splinters exploding into the room. Smoke filled the air, and through it stormed 2 men, black shapes against the glow of firelight. My rifle jammed in the chaos. I dropped it, drew the pistol, and fired point blank. One went down, the other lunged, tackling me hard to the ground. We grappled, fists and knives in raw survival. His breath was hot against my face, his blade flashing in the firelight. I twisted, blocked, slammed him into the wall. He snarled, tried again. And then Atlas. The shepherd, wounded but unbroken, launched from the hearth, teeth sinking into the man's arm. The knife clattered to the floor. I drove my fist into his jaw, felt bone crack, and he dropped. Atlas staggered back, panting, blood staining his bandage anew. "Good boy," I muttered, chest heaving. But the fight wasn't over. Through the smoke, another figure stepped in. Not a grunt. The way he moved, calm, deliberate, told me he was different. This was no mercenary. This was their leader. His eyes met mine across the chaos, and a cruel smile tugged at his lips. "You've caused me trouble, soldier," he said, voice like gravel. We circled each other, 2 predators in a burning cage. My pistol was empty. His knife gleamed. We collided. Blows landed heavy, each strike fueled by something deeper than survival. He was stronger, fresher. He drove me back, fists like iron, until I hit the wall, vision swimming. He pressed the blade to my throat, eyes cold with certainty. "You're just one man," he sneered. "And one man can't stop this." Then it happened. A sound that shattered the battle more than any bullet. "Leave him alone," the boy's voice. High, trembling, but fierce. Carl stood in the doorway, his small frame shaking, eyes wide with terror and defiance. For days he had been locked in silence, buried in trauma. But now, in the heart of fire and fear, he screamed. The leader's head jerked, eyes snapping toward the sound. Just for a second, but it was enough. I roared, all the grief and rage and love I had buried for 6 years pouring through me. I slammed my shoulder forward, twisting his wrist, the knife slicing a shallow line across my arm instead of my throat. I drove him back, fists crashing down like hammers, until he hit the floor, stunned. The cabin filled with noise, Atlas barking, Luna snarling, Rachel crying out, Carl's voice still ringing in the air. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the tide shift. The silence that had ruled that boy broke the enemy's certainty. His scream was more powerful than any weapon in my hands. I pinned the leader to the floor, my breath ragged, my knuckles raw. His eyes, once cold, now flickered with something else, doubt. And in that doubt I saw our chance. The siege was not over, but the battle had turned. A child's cry had broken the darkness. And for the first time in years, I believed we might survive the night. The man beneath me thrashed, his strength fueled by desperation, but I pressed the knife back against his throat, my arm bleeding, my chest heaving. Outside, the storm had quieted, but the war still raged. I heard more boots crashing through the brush, more gunfire snapping in the dark. For a moment I thought we were finished, that the weight of their numbers would finally crush us. Then came the roar of engines. Not the low growl of mercenary trucks, but something heavier, sharper, official. Red and blue lights flashed against the window slats, cutting through the smoke. A loudspeaker boomed across the ridge, commanding in clipped authority. "Sheriff's Department, drop your weapons and surrender." The mercenaries hesitated, their rhythm broken. A single beat of doubt pulsed through the night, and in battle, that was all it took. Gunfire rattled again, but this time it wasn't just mine. Sheriff Brody's deputies poured into the clearing rifles, blazing their shouts, merging with the dogs' furious barks. The mercenaries scattered, retreating into the trees, only to be met by floodlights and iron cuffs. I looked down at the man pinned beneath me, his smile gone, his bravado stripped bare. He sneered, but his eyes betrayed fear. "You think this ends here?" he spat. I pressed harder, the knife biting shallow into his skin. "It ends tonight." Two deputies stormed in, pulled him from my grasp, forced him to his knees, and cuffed his hands. Atlas barked once, sharp and final, as if sealing the moment. Rachel rushed forward, pulling Carl into her arms, sobbing with relief. The boy clung to her, but his eyes, bright, alive, found mine. His voice still echoed in my skull, the scream that had shattered his silence and turned the tide. I gave him a nod, and for the first time he smiled. Small, fleeting, but real. The cabin, once filled with smoke and gunfire, slowly quieted. Deputies secured the perimeter, bodies and weapons cleared. Brody himself entered, his hat dripping rain, his eyes scanning the wreckage. "Hell of a mess you've made, Jonas," he said. "Not my choice," I answered, my voice rough. He glanced at the drive, still clutched in my fist. His gaze hardened. "Is that what I think it is?" "It's proof," I said. "Proof that David Carson died for something bigger than himself. Proof that Kane isn't a visionary, he's a butcher hiding behind numbers and machines." Brody took it carefully, sealing it in an evidence bag. "We'll need to get this into the right hands. If what you say is true, this could bring half the state to its knees." "Not just the state," I muttered. "The whole damn country." Rachel stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "David gave his life for that. Make sure it means something." Brody nodded, softer now. "It will. I promise." Hours passed, as the last of the mercenaries were dragged away in shackles. The dawn broke cold and clear, the first light spilling across the ridge, gilding the ruins of the night before. My cabin stood battered but unbroken, its walls scarred by bullets, its windows shattered but still standing. Like me, I collapsed into the chair by the hearth, exhaustion crashing over me like a wave. Atlas limped to my side, laying his massive head on my knee. Luna curled against Rachel and Carl, her soft whines vibrating through the floor. The fire still burned, stubborn against the dark. Brody lingered at the door before leaving. "You did good," he said. "But this isn't over. Kane has money, power, friends in high places. He'll come looking." I met his eyes steady. "Let him. This time he won't find me alone." When the last deputy left, silence returned. But it was different now. Not the crushing silence of grief, not the suffocating emptiness that had haunted these walls for 6 years. This silence was softer, filled with breath and presence. The widow and her boy curled together on the rug, the dogs resting, their eyes half closed but watchful. For the first time in years, my cabin didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a home. I rose and stepped outside, the cold morning air filling my lungs. The mountains stretched wide, an endless mist rising from the valleys. For 6 years I had looked at this view and seen only exile. Today I saw possibility. Behind me, Carl's laugh, light, tentative, drifted through the open door. Rachel followed her voice, warm, soothing. Atlas barked once, and Luna answered with a playful yip. I turned back, and for a moment I simply watched. A woman scarred by loss but unbroken. A boy who had found his voice again. 2 dogs who had carried secrets through hell itself to deliver them here. And me, a man who thought his war was over, only to discover it had just changed shape. I went back inside and sat by the fire with them. Rachel leaned against the wall, eyes heavy but calmer. Carl dozed against Atlas's flank, one small hand tangled in the shepherd's fur. Luna nudged my arm until I scratched behind her ears. For once I didn't resist the closeness. The drive would go on to expose Kane. The world would know his empire was built on blood and chains. David's death would not be in vain. But that was tomorrow's fight. Tonight all that mattered was here. The cabin walls, scarred by bullets, would heal. The fire would burn brighter. The silence would no longer be empty but filled with new voices, new life. I realized something then. Something that hit me deeper than any battle ever had. Family isn't only blood. Sometimes it's who walks through the storm to find you. Sometimes it's who refuses to let you die alone. Sometimes it's two dogs carrying the weight of the world, a widow carrying her grief, a boy carrying his silence until he's ready to break it. I thought the mountain had buried me, but in truth it had been waiting to deliver them to my door. As night fell again, I stoked the fire high and sat with them, not as a soldier, not as a ghost, but as part of something whole. My exile was over. My war was over. And from the ashes of everything I had lost, something new was born. A family. Looking back on that night, it still feels unreal. The storm, the dogs, the blood on the floorboards, it all began like a ghost rising out of the life I thought I had buried. For years I believed silence would save me, that by retreating into the mountains I could outrun both memory and consequence. But the truth is, silence was never salvation. It was only waiting for the right moment to shatter. And it did the night Atlas and Luna came pounding on my door. Their arrival wasn't fate's accident. It was a chain of choices, sacrifices, and a final message entrusted to two animals who refused to give up. In saving them, I was pulled back into the world I had abandoned. In fighting alongside them, I rediscovered the part of me I thought was long gone. The cabin that once felt like a coffin became a fortress, and later, against all odds, a home. The widow and her son who staggered into my life carried grief as deep as mine, yet together we carved something new out of loss. The boy found his voice again in the moment we needed it most, breaking silence with a cry that turned the tide. That sound still echoes inside me. It wasn't just the roar of survival, it was the sound of rebirth. And the drive, the little black rectangle that bled meaning into every bullet fired that night. It carried proof that men worshipped as visionaries were nothing more than monsters in tailored suits. Their empire built on chains and shadows is unraveling now, exposed to the light. David's death was not in vain, but every victory carries its shadow. Those who deal in power and blood do not surrender quietly. For every man dragged away in cuffs, there are more still lurking, watching, waiting. And Cain, his name is still out there whispered in boardrooms and back alleys. If he learns I carry the ember of David's truth, he will come. And next time he won't send shadows, he'll bring fire. That's where this story leaves us for now. Before I close, I want to turn to you. You've walked this path with me step by step, through storm and silence, through fire and fear. Tell me, what would you have done if two dogs collapsed on your porch, carrying the weight of the world in their collars? Would you have opened the door, or would you have turned away, too afraid of what followed? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear them. And if this story gripped you, if you want to see where it leads, then subscribe and stay with us. Because this isn't the end. The storm may have passed, but the war it carried has only just begun. Some nights when the fire burns low and the mountain sleeps, I catch Atlas staring at the door, ears pricked. Luna paces the windows restless. They know as well as I do we haven't seen the last of what hunts us. The question is not if it will return, but when. And when it does, we'll be ready.